I believe that creators and artists, we all have that. You ask a bunch of 4-year-olds who can draw a doggy, you're going to see a bunch of hands raised. Ask the same question 10 years later, a lot fewer. Go to a corporate audience and say, who can draw a doggy? And it's like, well, no, I'm not an artist. Well, now with these tools, we have a much higher fidelity way of taking what's in our head and giving it some kind of tangible form at a much closer level. Doesn't mean it's perfect. Doesn't mean we're an artist, but we can communicate so much more richly now what's in our head and what we want. And I can't help but think that's an improvement.
This is the 30th Creativity Squared episode and is being released on the 1-year anniversary of OpenAI's announcement of ChatGPT. Today's guest is John du Pre Gaunnt, the founder of Culture and Code, a B2B podcast and newsletter focused on generative artificial intelligence for creative professionals. John and I met because we both launched podcasts and newsletters this year exploring the intersection of AI and creativity, and what a roller coaster ride it's been, a theme that comes up often in our conversation, looking back at the incredible explosion of ChatGPT and generative AI this past year. We recorded this conversation on the afternoon of Friday, November 17th. And needless to say, we had no idea how much we needed to buckle up for the news that shook the tech world, unlike anything we've seen since Apple's board fired Steve Jobs, that broke just a few hours after we wrapped the interview. If for some reason you missed what happened, in short, the board removed OpenAI co-founder and the face of AI, Sam Altman. Then shortly after that, Greg Brockman, also an OpenAI co-founder, quit. The board never gave a specific reason for why they removed Sam, except for possible disagreements over creating AI that's safe for the world. The news spiraled into mayhem, with over 700 of OpenAI's 770 employees threatening to leave if the board didn't quit and reinstate Sam, who at the time looked like he was going to become an employee of OpenAI's biggest investor, Microsoft. By the evening of Tuesday, November 21st, 5 days after his firing, Sam was back at OpenAI along with Greg to continue OpenAI's mission to achieve artificial general intelligence, saving OpenAI from potential collapse, which was a real possibility. The board was overhauled, and there are more wild twists and turns to the story that you can read about in the Creativity Squared newsletter. John and I both believe in the power of story. And one of my takeaways from this saga is that we cannot forget that behind these companies are not tech gods, but humans. And the stories that we tell are incredibly important. Time will reveal the full lessons this Game of Thrones level drama has for us. But one that I'm walking away with is a cautionary tale that we must not forget our humanity in the midst of all of this technology. What stories will we tell about this moment in time? And what future will we co-create together? So for today's show, you'll hear the original conversation I had with John. For more context on John, his analysis of the impact of emerging technology on media and marketing has been featured in the Economist, GigaOm, eMarketer, while his speaking credits include South by Southwest, Infinity Festival Hollywood, Podcast Movement, and the Monaco Media Forum. His consulting clients include financial services, media, and technology. John holds degrees in computer information systems and English literature. In 2019, he earned an executive certificate in technology and leadership from MIT Sloan School in partnership with the MIT Computer Science and AI Laboratory. Our conversation in this episode is a time capsule marking where we are on the 1-year anniversary of ChatGPT. Enjoy.
But have you ever thought, what if this is all just a dream?
Welcome to Creativity Squared. Discover how creatives are collaborating with artificial intelligence in your inbox, on YouTube, and on your preferred podcast platform. Hi, I'm Helen Todd, your host, and I'm so excited to have you join the weekly conversations I'm having with amazing pioneers in the space. The intention of these conversations is to ignite our collective imagination at the intersection of AI and creativity to envision a world where artists thrive.
Just a dream.
John, it is so good to have you on Creativity Squared. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
I used to say that I was the only podcast at the intersection of creativity and AI until I came across you. So it's so good to have another fellow newsletter person and podcaster in this specific niche. And so excited to discuss all things AI and creativity with you this episode.
In Winnie the Pooh, Tigger was my favorite character. I'm the only one. I had the same idea, and then I discovered your newsletter and went, oh wow, okay, let's take a look. And I liked the way that, number one, I was on the West Coast, you were in Cincinnati, and so I'm just like, okay, we're going to get various perspectives on the creativity, and at the same time, I was thinking, my God, I can't be the only one because this space just makes so much sense. And fortunately, we are well met.
Yeah, and your Culture and Code has a little bit of a different angle than Creativity Squared. But before we go into that, for those who are meeting you for the first time, why don't you share who you are, what you do, and your origin story that got you to where you're at today?
Okay. Well, I am John Gauntt. I'm based out of Seattle, Washington, and I am the founder and host of Culture and Code. Now, that's a new B2B podcast and newsletter that's looking at the intersection of creativity and artificial intelligence with audiences that are similar to yours. We're looking at media and entertainment, marketing, PR, eventually get into HR, training, corporate communications, because one of the things that we found is that a lot of the jobs in the service economy are about telling a story. And that story can be from kind of the branding, this is why we're such an amazing organization, all the way down to how do you operate this particular product or piece of technology or something like that. It's a narrative that helps people accomplish a goal. And in looking at that, I was like, well, okay. I've been covering artificial intelligence since 2016 on another podcast called The Augmented City. And we chose that name. You've heard the term suitcase word. We wanted like shipping container word. And we felt that AI and cities was a good way to start talking about transportation, talk about education, talk about healthcare. But we were finding in covering those topics that the common thread was some type of storytelling. Anyone who says that storytelling is just once upon a time, it doesn't really matter, really needs to look at the recent history of, how we handle the pandemic, among other things, how it deals with our politics, with everything, because humans are natural storytellers. And so that was sort of the editorial impetus for getting into Culture and Code, because we're saying that AI is really going to change things in a dramatic way. Now, the challenge has been, okay, if that's the idea, how do you make the idea, A, tangible, and equally, if not more important, actionable? And so that's where we are focused primarily on how to marry practical skills with critical thinking, because I firmly believe, and we can get into it a bit later, that if we don't really evolve our narrative skills along with our technical skills, we're basically just going to use AI to raise the production value of mediocrity. And I, quite frankly, don't want to live in a world that way. As far as origin story, I'm an accidental STEAM graduate. I have degrees in computer science and in English literature. And then also have been a technology analyst for several decades. I've covered internet when it first came out. I covered mobile internet. I covered social media as an analyst, the observer trying to make sense of things. And more importantly, for organizations like eMarketer and the Economist intelligence unit, try to make that sense quantitative. So you want to talk about storytelling, you try Excel is a great storytelling tool. And whether those stories are true or not, we can find out later. And then I got into podcasting in 2016 because I've always enjoyed oral storytelling. I come from East Tennessee, and so do you. That was one of the things where I was like, oh, I got to talk to her. And we grew up around people that we call characters. people who could spin a good yarn. And I realized, oral storytelling might actually be having a renaissance in a world that's more heads up and hands free and voice activated. So that was one of the things that drew me into podcasting. So that's sort of like the quick version of sort of how I got from there to here.
Amazing. And one of the things, too, that I'd love to have you share more about is Burner Face, because that's a podcast series that you did that got some accolades as well. So can you share with our listeners and viewers what Burner Face is?
Okay. Well, in our work, we do both nonfiction and fiction, which any management consultant will tell you is crazy. You have to concentrate on one thing. And I'm just like, why? But during a pandemic, I had been tinkering with this idea of a genre called design fiction. And what design fiction is the fictionalization that's based on real world technology. A lot of organizations actually do it. They'll draw scenarios of, what the world's going to be like in 2035 because they're trying to do product design or something like that. And it's not so much about how is the product going to evolve, but it's more of what's the world going to be like for this product to evolve in. And so that was the initial breadcrumb trail. And so we created a 5-episode scripted fiction podcast about Seattle in 100 years and being proper sci-fi. Yes, there are flying cars and talking cats. But the bigger point was, how can we write a riveting fiction story to where people are exposed to blockchain, drones, natural language processing, neural implants, all this exotic stuff, but they're exposed to it in a way that's focusing on human factors and a lot of decisions that people are going to be making, as opposed to making some fetish out of the gadget. And so Burner Face takes place in a world of ubiquitous facial recognition, and it's a play off the idea of a burner phone. You can more or less, if you want to kind of play off the books, you can rent a temporary facial ID with all of, as you can imagine, the restrictions and penalties and interest of being late involved. And so because of a windfall to where, I've got a bit of age on me, I won't give it out exactly, but for the first time in my life, I had a bit of literally free money fall in my pocket. And being a superstitious type, I'm like, well, I am going to burn every last single dime on this and use it not only to write a story, but to also experiment with the storytelling. So one of the things that differentiates Burner Face is that we use 25 human voice actors, but we also used 8 synthetic voices. And that was a very unique. This was in 2021, so this is when all the synthetic voices, text to voice, sounded kind of like the Cylons from the old Battlestar Galactica. And we decided to turn that into a virtue and say, well, if we're going to use a synthetic voice, then we have to dramatically depict the character as synthetic. And that was something to where I'm like, okay, look at how we're making editorial decisions. That's sort of the story behind the story. Sure, we're, like I said, flying cars and talking cats. That's the fun part in developing the characters, and it's always that kind of energy that keeps people going. And I love working with voice actors, but I also realized this is potentially a template, a concept car, if you will, for how we're going to be telling in-depth stories to where AI is part of the process. It's not directing the process. It's not an ignorant tool. I realize it's a contributor. Just doesn't happen to be human, but you have to position every single contributor from a position of strength if you're going to get something good. And so, it did win. It won 2 Signal Awards, one for audio fiction and recently for best trailer for a limited series. And along with various film festivals, best podcast in Amsterdam, Sweden, Hong Kong, official selection on Airfest, and many other film festivals. Now I'm getting peppered by film festivals left, right, and center. Oh, yeah. We heard about the podcast. And that's another aspect that we found, was that the line between what we're calling a podcast and what people are really working on and are being resonating with. Eventually, I think we're just going to declare victory and move on and call it, oral storytelling. And who knows, maybe podcast joins information superhighway as one of those terms that was extremely useful in its time, but has been outgrown. So yeah, you can go to www.burnerface.com. And that's the main website. We're also on all the usual suspects, Spotify, iTunes, etc. And have at it. I'd love to hear some feedback.
Yeah, well, thank you for sharing that. I watched a little bit ahead of this interview, and it's very cool. And I love not only are you giving creators practical tools, but putting them to use and showcasing them as well through that limited series.
One last thing about especially the website was that Burnerface is based on real-world climate science and technology futurism. And we were in that, how do we give it some teeth? And so late in the process of the story for the website, we partnered with a professional cartographer. One thing Seattle has is a lot of people who make maps because we have a large video game industry. And you can't have, could you imagine Game of Thrones if you didn't have a map of Westeros or something? So people who make fantasy maps are pretty thick on the ground here. And we found this guy and said, well, okay, let's imagine a world in 100 years where the sea levels rise 20 meters, close to 60, 70 feet, which unfortunately is becoming more and more plausible. 2021, it was crazy. Now it's only mildly crazy. And so we actually overlaid the city of Seattle with this actual geographic data. And if you go on the website and you look at the map, you can zoom in and see which neighborhoods are underwater, literally underwater. And you're also able to access different types of multimedia, which, they range from Easter eggs about the story to you find out, hey, kelp is important. It sequesters 8 times the amount of carbon that a tree does. Plus, you can make pharmaceuticals, you can make materials, you can put it on your Japanese food. And this is a way of giving people a learning back end. So we're saying, how can we write a kick-ass story that can also have an educational back end? So if you go on the website, check out the map. It's in the drop-down menu.
Amazing. And I'll be sure to put the link in the dedicated blog post that goes with this interview for all of our listeners and viewers. Well, and one reason are how John and I connected, not only through the podcast, we were on LinkedIn, but I saw a post that John did that he got invited or accepted to go to OpenAI's Dev Day. And I was slightly jealous and had a little FOMO and lived vicariously through John at Dev Day. But this episode is episode 30 for Creativity Squared, and it's coming out on the 1-year anniversary of ChatGPT's announcement. So it's an exciting episode, and so excited to have John on the show. But speaking of Burnerface being so futuristic, when we were talking about the themes for this episode, we're like, why don't we do a where are we in this moment in time? Because it has been a wild year for us, both personally and professionally, launching our podcast, but, with the explosion of Gen AI capturing everyone's imagination. So I guess we could start with Dev Day, since you were so privileged to get to go there. And what were some of the biggest takeaways for you? And then we can kind of dive into some of the big milestones that we've all kind of experienced and seen this year.
Well, first off, for Dev Day, I was not subtle to OpenAI. I remember I was working, it was been September, around September 6th, September 7th, when they made the announcement. Working late, I see this update that says, hey, OpenAI is going to have its first Dev Day. If you're interested, you have to go through an application process or something. And I knew instinctually, I'm like, man, this is going to be super oversubscribed with, the world-class developers and such. So, how me, little content creator and stuff. And so after filling out all the information, they had sort of the open text box of, why do you want to come? Or something to that effect. And I started out with, one of those vast, how you would answer like an SAT question. But then I was like, oh, no way this is going to work. And so I just simply wrote, I am a podcaster trying to humanize AI through the power of storytelling. And you need, in capital letters, you need people like me at this meeting. And then I didn't think anything of it. And then a couple of weeks later, I got the invitation. I was like, uh-oh. Not that my mouth got me in trouble, but it's like, okay, now I have to now I have to actually live up to it. And so I went down there, and that was on November 6th on that month. So I got there the day before. I went down there, and I was struck that aside from another person, Chad Nelson, who I believe has been on your podcast, who made a great film called Critters with a Z, highly recommended, I was one of the very, very, very few content creators who was not part of industry press. Of course, the press was 3-4 rows deep. But as far as like people saying, yeah, I use AI to make content, we were very thin on the ground. So that was sort of the strange side. But I also found a lot of developers were very eager to speak to me, because among the things that you would see, and I've been to multiple, technology developer days and demonstrations, we still seem to launch technology around the same kind of tasks. Help me organize my calendar. Help me organize my to-do list. Who should I meet? Who should I know? And I'm not belittling those, but I'm saying those are sort of like the poster child applications that they want to demonstrate new technology. And I was thinking with generative AI, you need to go into media and especially into content creation, because we're the canaries in the coal mine, as far as like what's going to happen to the rest of the service economy as AI ripples across. Now, as far as the overall takeaways, there's a lot of really good summaries and YouTube. I mean, the videos are up on YouTube right now, but the overall vibe that I got, especially and just walking around and opening my ears, which is a great habit that podcasters have. We're incessant spy. We can sit in an airport and our ears kind of grow, shrink, depending on who's having a good conversation. But many of the developers are sort of like, okay, I get it. I can understand what it can do. But how do I truly differentiate myself on scale and efficiency? Because scale and efficiency are the two kind of holy grails that all tech apps or technologies will pursue. And the point about generative AI is that might not be the right question to be asking, because the scale of which you can do things with AI and the efficiency you can do things with AI, it's sort of like people with shovels saying, how are we going to retrain so that we can beat this steam shovel that just came around? It's a useless competition. You got to rethink the rules from the rules point of view, as opposed to how does this change the rules? No, they're not change the rules. They're new rules. And that was the core vibe that I got away from, that I took away from this particular event.
Thank you for sharing and for letting all of us live vicariously through you that day. Hopefully, I'll get to join you next year at their Dev Day. Well, and one thing too that we're talking about, just kind of like milestones. At that conference, they announced the custom GPTs, where everyone can kind of make their own agent future, or like the future will be AI agents, where we can create our own, ChatGPTs customized. But looking back, it's kind of like this year has been so fast and furious that, when ChatGPT originally launched, it's hard to kind of remember that ChatGPT became the fastest growing app ever, even though they don't use the word app, with 100 million users within a month, and just like exploded on the AI scene. So what, in your mind, what are some of like the big milestones in addition to that's happened this year? Because you and I have both been on this like AI roller coaster through our podcasts with everyone else too.
Well, actually, if you track what's been November 30th, 2022, you can argue that that's the day the starting gun went. Sometime I can't remember the exact date in 1996 when the Netscape browser came out, but I would put it, in somewhat similar terms. I mean, that was the day that powerful artificial intelligence became accessible to the masses. And just like with early internet, the initial bias was text. So ChatGPT, everyone's talking about how it could write. And then what happens after text? You get image, and that's DALL-E, and that's Midjourney. And that's when people go, oh, wow, this is amazing. And then video comes after that, and then games. And so as far as like the content experiences that are vital, AI has been tracking internet almost in a scary way of text to image to video to cloning voices. And, Lord knows what's going to be coming next. But when I started playing with ChatGPT, which would have been in January of this year, I found that it's like, wow, this really changes how I approach my writing, not simply for how it writes, but equally, if not more important, how it reads. When I could take some of my old writing and then say, hey, take a look at this and sort of tell me what you think, summarize it, and it was pretty good. I was like, oh, wow, this just changed how I did writing because I realized that from a time savings point of view, this is what's really huge.
I feel very privileged, or I have a friend at OpenAI who gave me a demo in October of last year before it was publicly announced. And it really captured my imagination. And we did this limited TV series that I have floating off in my head, mostly an Excel document right now. And we did the first scene, and I was just blown away by how fast it was and how good it was. And that really captured my imagination of how I could collaborate with this tool. And I was even thinking, I was like, oh, maybe I could, give myself 2 years, write this with ChatGPT, and then the tech will be good enough to make it all with AI. But instead, I launched a podcast, and the tech is like so good right now that, this could be feasible within the next 12 months with the way that AI and video generation is coming. But yeah, for other milestones for this year, I mean, it's like all of the big companies have gotten into the space. We've also seen new companies emerge, like Anthropic, in the Gen AI scene. I don't know when Stability AI was first came onto the scene, but they've done some really interesting things as well in terms of the open source approach. But yeah, I guess just kind of looking down a memory road this year, what are there any other big standout moments for you in 2023 on the Gen AI roller coaster?
Well, one thing that did capture my attention was how fast so many large organizations not just simply made announcements and put out press releases and presentations and stuff. That's sort of expected to stay up with the news cycle, but then actually started putting some money behind it. That caught my attention because it suggested to me that large organizations, I'm not just talking about big business. I mean, while I was at OpenAI, I met people from the Department of Defense, and they were talking about that now, through both the Biden administration's AI policy document. I mean, regardless of leave the politics outside, regardless of how you land on the government and technology, the fact remains, by far, they're the largest purchaser of technology. And so decisions that are made at the federal level have a ripple effect throughout the entire industry. But I was amazed at how quickly these elephants pivoted to say, we're going into Gen AI. Yeah, I know we were into blockchain or something like that last year, and it's still important, but we know that this is more important. And you hardly ever hear large organizations do that. They're always sort of like, yeah, we've been doing this for a long time and we decided to sort of give it a little more. No. There are a lot of large organizations saying, wow, this is huge. And we're just as surprised as most individuals are. And we're just going to get behind it 90 degrees because if we don't, we're going to get steamrolled. And I was like, oh, that's some refreshing honesty. But also, it does prove that if it's big enough, elephants can dance. So that was one of the things I pulled away from 2023. Now, in 2024, and this is part of our discussion earlier, part of 2024 and 2025 especially, that's when those intentions will get their real test. And we will know, who's real, because to make a lot of these initiatives work, there's going to have to be some hard trade-offs. And so that's something I'm going to be watching, especially second quarter of next year, because by that time there'll be no more news value to say, hey, we're making a big initiative around OpenAI, around generative AI. That'd be like people joining the internet bandwagon. I mean, no company says, hey, we launched a website. That's not news anymore. So using AI at one level is going to be banal. And because it's banal, it's actually extraordinary because of the time compression.
Yeah, that's so true. Well, and I think another thing that's interesting from when we first connected and hopped on Zoom to now, I mean, everything's just moving so fast, OpenAI's Dev Day, but also we've seen an executive order come from the White House, which we've never really seen adequate regulation around social media. And this is coming from a year where, as you said, every company's getting on the Gen AI bandwagon, while Tristan Harris was leading the movement to try to call for a 6-month pause, which no one did, just steamrolled on. But it's been an interesting year of
Now that we've reached cruising altitude in our flight, can we pause the aircraft for a bit? That takeoff was a little nauseating. I never bought the 6-month pause.
Yeah, well, as much as I understand. Actually, what's funny is I watched their presentation, the AI Dilemma, the night before I officially launched my podcast, and it was such a sobering presentation to watch for a show that I embrace AI, the good, the bad, and everything in between. But I was like, what am I doing? What am I getting into? So it's just kind of like, buckle up, we're going to go.
Yeah. You've seen those YouTube videos of the people who are strapping into the roller coaster. Then there's that one person say, I want to get out. No. Now that the seatbelt's gone click, they are like, oh my God, what's going to happen?
I feel a roller coaster is the best way. And also, we've seen, I think another big thing that's happened this year, and I believe you had a guest on your show that's discussed this too, is in terms of AI and the entertainment industry, we've seen the writers and actors strike. And AI was a piece of the negotiations that happened, but there was a lot more to it. But I was curious, what were some of your takeaways from some of your conversations around AI related to the entertainment industry too?
Well, number one, I was really happy to see it debated out on the street. So kudos to the unions. Well, regardless of how you land on that issue, kudos that they basically said, look, this is real and we're not going to be signing away on Happy Talk. Now, what you actually think of the final agreement, we're going to see how that plays out. But this was a debate that needs to happen, and it needs to happen in bright sunlight, not behind closed doors. So that was point one. Point two, and it was where I actually started thinking the same as Stuart Lyons. He is the line producer of Breaking Bad, Better Call Saul. He said, a lot of people think that Hollywood is this kind of self-contained little egotistical ecosystem. There is some truth, but more importantly, new technology washes over media and content creation first. as far as like being able to transform the way people work. And there are a lot of people in the creative industry. And that's not just simply Hollywood. I came from publishing. I was a journalist for some years. We've got direct experience of management getting a shiny new toy and saying, well, we don't need people anymore, and so Happy Talk was not going to persuade a lot of the writers and the actors who had the direct experience. Now, going forward, I think the key thing and the one ally that the writers and the actors can really thank is the U.S. Copyright Office, who basically said, if it's all algorithmic, you can't copyright. Because from that point, that means Hollywood, you have no IP unless you involve a person. And so the negotiations were more about how do we get the dramatic talent working with AI in a way that's not only helping us make a better product, but also making a product, a work product, movie, song, whatever kind of series, game, where we can get some formal intellectual property recognition by the Copyright Office. So by basically saying only a human can copyright a creative work, that was a huge reason of why the studios eventually started negotiating in better faith, because if they could make defendable IP purely algorithmically, I'm not saying all of them would do it, but definitely some of them would do that. And then you start dividing up the industry. So I think that on balance with the actors and the writers, it's not time to declare victory and just go back to work. Hollywood's changed. There's no going back. It's a new normal. Well, not even normal. It's just new. We're going to, again, 2024 and 2025, we're going to find out a lot more. So if you were to put the Hollywood strikes, the way that government and business pivoted, the way that the news cycle was driven, 2023 is going to be studied decades from now for people's PhD thesis. And who knows, those people might not all be human.
I think one other moment that stands out from this year is also the Kevin Roose Sydney story that hit some of the cycles. Because one of the things that Tristan Harris and Asa Raskin said in their presentation is, if social media was a race to the bottom of our emotions, like anger and fear, then the chatbots, it's about the race to intimacy, because they can feel human, they can feel empathetic, even though they're not. And then what was it, when Microsoft launched their Bing chatbot early to some journalists, Kevin Roose at the New York Times, he's also one of the co-hosts of Hard Fork, which is another podcast I love, started interacting with it. It kind of went rogue and was like, you don't love your wife because you love me. And it got into this like very intimate conversation. And because of that, they put on a lot more guardrails before launching publicly. But I feel like in the canon of 2023, that was a really pivotal moment of, without the proper guardrails, how quickly these things can turn. And we don't know if Sydney did that because the machine wanted to, because it's just algorithmic and trying to figure out what would make an interesting story, because Kevin Roose is a journalist. Is it, they're trying to predict what to say to engage the person? So was it just a way to engage the viewer to stay longer on the chatbot? Like, we don't actually know because of the black box of why the chatbot went that way. In my mind, that was a pivotal moment for AI and the chatbots too.
Well, take a step back and first look at what is feeding these machines. The AI has learned what the internet has to teach, which can be a pretty scary thought sometimes. But early internet was about how did we digitize print culture? How do we bring newspapers and magazines online? How do we digitize books? Now, in all of those situations, the source data of a book, magazine, etc., was also edited. It was put into a particular point of view. It was fact-checked. It was copy edited. And so you have that type of input. Then comes social media, which is much more free form, a lot closer to people's id, as you said. Social. We did. We at the Augmented City. We did one of our first shows approximately 4 days after Donald Trump was elected in 2016. So basically said, if this, regardless of the politics, what Trump did was he helped social media take over from mass media for choosing an American president. Simple as that. CBS News, NBC News, ABC News contributed, but they did not determine how people found out about Donald Trump. Twitter did. Okay. And then Twitter, what he would put on Twitter was then picked up by news articles and then put into the bloodstream of the body politic, for good or ill. Again, I'm just talking about what happened factually on the ground. So we asked the question, well, if social media did this in 2016, what's going to happen, and we're going to find out next year, what's going to happen when political parties are able to harness the power of AI to not only do micro-targeting, you need to reach this persuadable voter, but also micro-delivery of the exact message they want to hear, and they might not even know that's the message they want to hear. And it's put into that type of language. What kind of politics are we going to have? And our response was, no, it's not going to be so much like Big Brother as it's going to be like Boss Tweed. You can create a true political machine around artificial intelligence. Why? Because it helps you not only tell a better story, but you're able to tell that story in a way that resonates at the individual level. Because historically, this is what internet did. Internet gave you the ability to take one message and distribute to millions. Okay? What AI does is let you look at millions of audience, and distribute micro messages that sort of add up to the big idea. Now, that's in politics, but it's also in how we're going to be talking about brands. It used to be A/B testing. Well, A/B testing is still a very solid methodology, but I would expand it to like A to Z to the 15th power testing that you can do with AI, because what actually persuades people to make a major purchase is grouped in the general area, but the final straw that either breaks the camel's back or tips them over to actually pull the trigger and say, yes, this is what I'm going to buy, typically boils down to the individual. They'll finally make that last rationalization, even though their heart made the decision maybe a month ago. But they'll come, the men will finally say, I'm getting this Jeep because it's safe. And they've got 15 other reasons, but finally being able to give them that last justification tips it over to the purchase. And what AI is doing is enabling you to tailor that for millions of people, not just what's A, B, or C message going to resonate the most. So in that sense, it's very scary, but also flip that around, and that same capability can now be used to help the millions of Algebra 2 students who are struggling right now out there in the US, and they're 14 years old, and they've got to take their Algebra 2 test, and they're freaked out. And they're being told, well, this is the one way to learn, when actually with AI, there are multiple ways to learn. So we can go into a bit later. I'm not 100% of, it's just a tool and it's neutral. But I do believe that we can find the dystopian and utopian use cases in just about any type of AI capability.
I couldn't agree more. And I think it comes down to the people behind the tools and the intentionality behind the tools too, and how we put them to use. So I definitely agree on that front. Another news story that got a lot of headlines this year was the fake Drake and Weeknd song. And I know you mentioned that content creators are kind of the canary in the coal mine. Someone on the show, and I forget who said it right this second, said that actually music is a great canary in the coal mine, because what happens in the music industry usually then spreads to other entertainment. And we had the fake Drake and Weeknd song, and it ruffled a lot of feathers, and all the platforms took them down. Now they're having AI policies and letting them up. But what was kind of your take on that news cycle or news story?
Okay, well, this is a bit like talking about a bad relationship I had in college. One of the first companies that I worked with back in the early noughts was trying to make music applications for mobile phones, because we saw that's what people are carrying around. They're not carrying around transistor radios. And this was pre-iPhone, so your position on the carrier's deck, on deck or off deck application, was pretty important of whether people are actually going to discover you. And music is like one of the biggest intellectual property hairballs that will ever be created now or in the future. I want to see how, if AI can truly untangle music, it's going to, from an intellectual property and investability point of view, it's going to be extraordinary. And by the way, I'm going to give a shout out to a company that you should be looking for called Jukebox, JXBX. It's run by a guy named Scott Cohen, who had a company called The Orchard, which was one of the largest independent labels. But what Jukebox is going to be doing, I think they launched last month, is taking the power of technology and enabling people, ordinary, regular retail investors, to invest into the catalog of an artist, and not just at the catalog level, but at the song level, at the stem level of music content. And that has the capability of revolutionizing how artists actually can develop their craft and create a business. It's not that, we're going to get rid of the labels or anything like that. It's not saying I'm going to change the rules. It's like, no, we're going to make a new game with new rules. And I would hardly encourage you to check out Jukebox. But back to music, with the ability to not only reproduce, whatever kind of melodies and different types of musical elements you want, but also the fidelity of someone's voice, it's really going to be changing a lot of legacy too. And that's going to be different. It's like Johnny Cash singing punk, which I think if you could speak to the actual ghost of Johnny Cash, you'd be all over it. But at the same time, for the people who are part of the estate of Johnny Cash, the value of their estate is that historical legacy that's frozen in amber in the sense of master recordings. And there's a whole chain of custody of who has rights to that recording. That's how we built the music industry in the 20th century. The thing we got to look at is that the 20th century is by far the exception of the history of music. Music's as old as humanity. Some of the oldest artifacts we ever found. I think there's some bone flute in Germany that's like 40,000 years old. We've been making music since we've been human. We've had a music business since the 20th century, effectively speaking, once you got it out of the churches, at least in the Western world. And so this idea, at least in my mind, that there's something sacred about the way that music is captured and then bought and sold, as an economic entity. I'm going to leave the aesthetics to the side, but I mean, as an economic entity, I'm not that fussed that AI is upsetting that apple cart, because having been there, it's always been an insider's game. And that's something that technology historically has done, is it's disrupted. I hate to use that management term, but that's the proper term. It's disrupted the old insider's game so that it can create a new insider's game. But there's always this gap between those two where artists and creators can truly thrive. And then, yeah, it'll coalesce under a new set of rules. And then eventually that will get old enough and we'll have a new inside game, and then new technology will come around and we'll blow that up. So as far as like Drake in the Weekend, I listen to it. Yeah, it's a fun tune. Is it the end of civilization? Nah, not even close.
I appreciate that. Well, and I think one phrase that I've heard a lot this year and even have said on the show many times is just kind of the democratization of creativity, where you kind of mentioned just now that tech breaks up the institutions and the music industry. And I think one thing that really excites me about the intersection of AI and creativity is you're just going to have so many more people with access to tools that they might not have had otherwise, being able to share their stories and voices from all walks of life and parts of the world, being able to share stories and express themselves in ways that we are, mediums haven't existed before, and just to be able to surface and hear these stories that we haven't got to hear before. So that's one thing I'm excited about. So I feel like you and I could talk all day, but we've got just a little bit more time on the interview, and I want to cover like a speed round of tech announcements this year, a little outside of AI, that will definitely be following in 2024. So on my list is the Humane AI pen, which was just recently announced, the Apple Vision Pro, NVIDIA blew up, Neuralink got FDA approval for their first human testing. And then another thing that I think is very interesting is the brain-computer interface, because I got to play my first game of just thinking and interacting with a computer and playing a game with just thinking as the only modality to interact with the game. So I was curious, your reactions on any of those, or any more that you would add to the list too.
Well, let's take one slight step back in this year, and I'll ask you a trick question. How many AI generated pictures of single people looking off into the distance, almost like they're out of a fashion magazine, have you seen? Probably zillions. How many really good pictures of multiple characters where there's a focal point, where there's where almost like you'd look at some painting, Christ in the Last Supper, to where there's all kinds of different perspectives, but it adds up into something emergent. We're not even close there with AI. The vast majority of content examples that I've seen that have been algorithmically generated have been tech demos more than stories. So beyond the tools, what I'm looking for, especially next year, are people who can use artificial intelligence to actually improve a narrative arc of something. Because storytelling and stories, and it's one of the reasons why you're doing creativity, I'm doing culture and code, is much of the way that we program our culture. It's when they say knowledge is learning from your mistakes and wisdom is learning from somebody else's mistakes. And a lot of our stories are do this, don't do that, see what happens. Okay. Strip it down to its barest essentials. And that's what storytelling from a utility point of view is. We're doing that. We're also identifying ourselves as groups. AI is now just starting to get into that area. When I say AI, what I'm talking about is not the tools themselves, but people who are learning to work in a new way in the context of new tools. That is the high ground, in my opinion. Not just competitively, but also where we need to go so that we can raise the value of narrative storytelling, not just its production value. And so a lot of these tools are bringing more people into the mix, which I think is foundational for humanizing AI. I'd said previously, I went to the OpenAI Dev Day and they were showing the wonders of the technology for helping them with their calendar. And I'm not belittling that. I'm just saying that is a pretty standard use case that the tech industry loves to do. Thank God they weren't using AI to order pizza, because that would have disappointed me. But the larger point is that to actually improve the technology, we need to have non-specialists get better with AI. And so whether you're talking about the humane pen, which I think for medical applications is wonderful, because anything that can help us mitigate this constant toggling between having eye contact with a patient and having to turn away and type something into a screen or read something off a screen and break eye contact. Any technology that can help improve that experience is going to improve a patient experience. And we desperately need that in medicine. So I'm looking forward to that. Neuralink, in our fiction story, Burnerface, we do a lot around neural interfaces, because if anything, we're seeing a blurring of kind of the organic and the inorganic world, which some people say, oh, that's creepy. Well, you put on a pair of glasses, you're blurring that boundary. You're using some type of modification to change your organic experience with the world. I, for one, like eyeglasses. I, for one, in a few years will probably need hearing aids. I, for one, don't mind the idea of a pacemaker if I need one. You go to a 50th anniversary reunion. One of the party games is how many real hips are in the audience. We modify ourselves all the time down to our bodies with technology. So that doesn't scare me as much. It's sort of a natural progression of things, and I think that a lot of the technologies that you listed are going to be actually taken out of the labs and put into the field, and we're going to see what's really going to go forward and not. Because, for example, with your thoughts. A metaphor that I learned from Dr. Christoph Koch at the Allen Institute for Brain Science is, imagine you're in a blimp and you're flying over an NFL football stadium on a Sunday, and you want to hear an individual conversation in the stands, and you drop a microphone. That's sort of like where we are with trying to get a probe down into the actual brain tissue, down to sort of the neuron or the synapse level. And so it's pretty clear that the touchdown is scored, you hear the roar from the crowd, something happened. But to really understand nuance, we're still pretty far off from that.
Yeah, and I think one thing too, something that you said that made me think of it is a lot of the Gen AI output has been just kind of showcasing its capabilities of like, look how great this is, not being generated from traditional design and animation and video tools, but still is far from being as good as the traditional tools, to be honest. But I think one of the interesting things that I'm excited about is what is going to be the next Citizen Kane for these new mediums, and how is that going to make us rethink some different formats, or narrative storytelling, or whether it's immersive in Quest 3 or Apple Vision Pro or whatever shape it takes. We haven't seen anything. We've seen like the tech produce really fascinating and interesting things, but nothing fundamentally different than our current entertainment. At least I haven't seen anything yet. I'm not sure if you've come across anything that's really expanded your thinking about mediums and how they can be. Just expanded our thinking about what we can do with them.
Okay. I'm a bit conflicted. Let me put it this way. Wait till next March at South by Southwest, and I might have something to show you. We are.
Ooh, okay.
Yeah.
You have my attention, John.
Okay. We are looking at how can AI enable us to create a visual layer around a podcast that actually makes sense. That actually, elevates the audio story in a way. When without going into too much detail, think of a storytelling experience that contains the elements that is driven by a podcast, but it also contains the elements of a graphic novel and a film. And it makes sense. That's where we're poking around. We wrote Burnerface specifically to be that equivalent of the 440 Dodge Duster that, you got these teenagers bashing on it and turning it into a stock car and, modifying it and putting a cherry bomb muffler, up on top and doing all those types of modifications. You're going to see it in media. You're going to see it in fiction first. It's whatever kind of fiction we're talking about. Those are the areas I would look for. And I would also encourage people to read up on their Marshall McLuhan, because there are several things that are tried and true. Number one, it says we march backward into the future, which, if you kind of look at the history of media, television comes out. Who were the first people in front of the camera? Radio guys wearing headsets with ashtrays, smoking cigarettes, and having a conversation. So typically, we take what we did in the old media and we try it in the new container. Second thing he said was that I'm starting to believe very much is that he said the first meal of a new medium is the old medium, meaning that the first meal of the internet was magazines and newspapers. That's what it ate. That's what it digitized. That's how it extracted value. And you can see what happened to newspapers and magazines. And AI has eaten the internet. Basically, it's all the stuff that we, or even this interview, is going to be scraped. It's going to be ingested into these models. It's going to be atomized. It's going to be used. And so just like with internet, the first 5-8 years, first decade of it, what we were seeing was, oh, wow, that's a cool magazine online now. We're online. And then sort of the native storytelling methods, not just social media and feeds, but even design metaphors like parallax for websites, that started to find their own water level. And I think the similar process is playing out with AI. Now, I think it's playing out faster than it did with internet, with AI, but we're not skipping steps. And one of the things that was in our interview with Stuart Lyons was he said, yes, AI is helping a lot of things. I mean, he gave a great example. You've seen these LED walls that enable. So think of how many writers want to write in a romantic kiss in front of the sunset. I mean, from a writer's point of view, it's a no-brainer. You want to make a movie, a nice romantic kiss in front of a sunset. Well, you're going to have about maybe 8 to 10 minutes of light from a natural sunset that's going to work. Whereas you take a LED screen, you can make the sunset for 7 hours. You can do multiple takes on it. So you get that kind of efficiency to where what previously a producer would read the script and say, romantic kiss at the sunset, that's going to take us 4 hours to set up. It's going to cost at least $10,000 to $15,000 for that one kiss. Just in production costs alone, how important is it? Well, that's kind of taken off the plate now. And so the creative palette has dramatically expanded of what we can do, but it doesn't mean that trade-offs have gone away. If I was to hopefully leave your audience and my audience with one thing, is that anyone who says, oh, we're in this age of creativity without constraints, that person really doesn't understand what creativity is, because creativity is about working around constraints, working within constraints, understanding new constraints. And so I think a lot of the challenges that we have to make that kind of AI native media is going to be understanding what are the new constraints. But I still need to hire people. I still need to figure out what's a fair compensation for people. I still need to figure out how am I going to market this thing. I still need to figure out who's my audience. And I'm not saying AI can't do it. I mean, AI is going to be a great tool for doing it. I'm just saying that work hasn't gone away. That work's been transformed.
I have so many reactions to what you said because it was so good. And I love Marshall McLuhan. And he has a quote out there that's great. That's we create the tools and then our and then they shape us. But one of the things too that I think is really interesting is, I'm so curious what you're working on, is not only is it taking old mediums and applying them to the new mediums, but we're kind of seeing the merging of the mediums together. I've used the phrase before, just as a content marketing best practice, you have the democratization of the consumption of content, where, this is a long form podcast interview that takes the shape of, do you want to listen to it? Do you want to watch the video? Do you want to read the transcript? Do you want to read the blog recap of it, or the short little trailer that we put on social media? And it has great accessibility built into it too, of depending on your ability or just however you want to consume the content, we're giving you as many options as possible to do it. But it seems like with some of these new tools merging like AR over traditional mediums, that we're now seeing not only the choice of how you want to consume it, but the mediums merging together for more multimodality types of storytelling. One example is Artivive, which the CEO was on the show, and they take pretty much any visual image and can turn it into a QR code to add an AR layer to it. So say you're in an art museum, you can look at a painting and then through the AR app, see maybe the original drawings that were painted over. So you're getting one layer of the painting and then a second layer on top of it, of the backstory of, what was covered up by the artist and why. So plus an audio, if you're listening to the headsets at museums. So like the merging of the mediums together in one storytelling tool, I think is kind of a fascinating play as well. And then one thing that you said about the constraints, one of my, I don't know where I got this from, but one of my favorite little quotables around creativity is like, this composer was asked to, write a piece, and it was like the blank page problem. He's like, I don't know where to begin. And then was told, imagine a composer walks into a bar and sees a woman on a bar stool in a gorgeous red dress, and then she falls off of it. And he's like, I'm inspired.
Well, let me leave you with this idea of creativity. And it's one of the things to where when I first read it in a research paper, it's like, even if it's not true, I really want to believe it. It goes like this. We have this bias that before writing was invented, our ancestors were kind of, brutish, and that, they uncivilized, etc. And then, they found the cave drawings in Lascaux and Spain and China and other things, 30,000 years old, 40,000 years old. And writing, the best we can get back is about 9 or 10,000. And by the way, it wasn't poetry. It was a receipt for beer. And so the idea was this: what if these people who were composing art inside the caves were also composing art outside the caves, and the only thing that survived that we see is what was in the caves? Okay, because as you can imagine, 30,000 years on the outside, the chances of finding, trees that have been decorated, other things that have had human marks on them, it's going to be really hard. And so actually their world was suffused in art, because it's sort of like you have to ask yourself the logical question. You've got this amazing talent to create art, but you're only going to do it inside a cave. That's a hard one to swallow. And then when you start really imagining, well, wait a minute, we do need art, not just simply to humanize, but for very practical reasons. Because think for a moment, when you walk downtown, how many symbols and signs and colors and marks and navigation aids you see on a typical modern street, where the crosswalk is, when to walk, what the stop sign is, those types of symbols. Is that all a modern thing, or is it something that's been intrinsic in our human experience? And so when you think about AI, we like to think of this kind of monolithic, super brain, almost like out of the the first Tron movie or something like that, when actually these little micro pieces of intelligence are going to be embedded all through our environment, just like they are right now. And so in one sense, the premise behind Tron is real. Only instead of atomizing our bodies with a laser to fit onto a chip, we've actually sprayed this huge cloud of computer chips all around in our environment and have blown a computer up to planet size. Now we're just walking around inside. Just like our Paleolithic ancestors walked around with drawings all inside. And so in that sense, I believe that creators and artists, we all have that. You ask a bunch of 4-year-olds who can draw a doggy, you're going to see a bunch of hands raised. Ask the same question 10 years later, a lot fewer. Go to a corporate audience and say, who can draw a doggy? And it's like, well, no, I'm not an artist. Well, now with these tools, we have a much higher fidelity way of taking what's in our head and giving it some kind of tangible form at a much closer level. Doesn't mean it's perfect. Doesn't mean we're an artist. But we can communicate so much more richly now what's in our head and what we want. And I can't help but think that's an improvement. Now, at the same time, are people going to do terrible things with it? Are they going to make, subversive art? Are people going to be, basically leaving curses or saying, so-and-so does these terrible things? Of course. Go to the British Museum. You can find evidence of Romans who made graffiti. Maximus Whoeverus is a cheat. I think there's a cuneiform tablet that's over 4,000 years old, and it is the world's first customer complaint form, where they were talking about that the beer was bad or something like that, and they immortalized it into a medium. We're going to be doing the same. We've been doing this recursively as humans since we've been humans. And I think that if we can keep that open mind that in that sense, AI is just a tool, we can domesticate it better. And I think domestication is going to be the proper verb, because AI, in my opinion, is something that is going to be a companion with us. And we'll need it, especially for the problems that we're facing right now with climate change and us making a more sustainable world.
Yeah, I agree so much. And one of my complaints about me painting, because I love creative endeavors, but what's in my head, just because I haven't put the skill set to proper practice and whatnot, never comes out in my paintings that well. Even sometimes photography, what I'm looking at, I'm not capturing it the way that my eyes see it. But the idea that you can take what's in my head without relying on, some skill set with my hands or whatever, and can get it out of my head, I actually think that's really exciting to transpose what's in my head. Also, can be very scary too, because there's a lot of different implications that come with reading people's minds in that way, but also very scary too.
Well, along with Marshall McLuhan, I'd be reading the Harry Potter books, because human language is now a programming language, and so people really, I'm talking about just people outside the tech industry. A lot of people, if you ask them, they don't want to operate technology. They want to cast spells. They want to be like Jean-Luc Picard and say, "Make it so." Number one, they have that chasm between my will and my ability to exert my will shrunk, because ultimately that's what magic is being able to control the forces of nature, to use words to set things in motion. And effectively speaking, when we're thinking about prompting, that's what we're doing. A prompt is a set of words that set things in motion. So, new book of spells. That's basically what we're dealing with.
Well, I think Arthur C. Clarke had a quote, something along the lines of, the best technology actually feels as if it were magical or as magic. And I feel like for today's episode, number 30 on the anniversary of OpenAI's announcement of ChatGPT, the magic of technology is a great way to end this episode. I guess one thing before we do our sign off, is there anything else that you want our listeners and viewers to know related to our conversation or your projects, or anything you'd like to make sure that's included in today's conversation?
Well, number one, I would highly recommend that they listen to your podcast, they listen to my podcast, and they actively search out people who are trying to deal in this nexus of creativity and artificial intelligence, because effectively speaking, creativity is the new productivity. We're going to be able to use AI. When I say create, I think produce is a better verb. We'll be able to produce content even more than internet and social media. So if you're already occasionally a little queasy from the kind of what comes over your feed, if you are not becoming a critical consumer, you're going to be overrun. It's going to be the equivalent of fast food for your brain. And we know where that can take your body. And a little bit's not that bad now and then, but the kind of work that you're doing with Creativity Squared, kind of work we're trying to do with Culture and Code. Also, if you look into, I can't remember the exact name of his organization in Los Angeles, there's a guy named Todd Terrazas, who is organizing Hollywood community, the creative technology community of Hollywood around AI. Keep your eye on what's happening in creativity and media, because that is the early indicator of what's going to eventually be happening to you. And when I say eventually, that could just be a year. So, it's exciting. It's giddy. It's the roller coaster. Don't eat a lot of pizza before you take the ride.
Yeah, but buckle up. I don't think 2024 is going to slow down at all.
We just got a presidential election.
Indicator.
We just got a presidential election to add a bit more spice to the AI mix.
Yeah. Well, John, it has been such a pleasure having you on the show. I'm a listener of your show and definitely encourage everyone on Creativity Squared to listen. And we'll definitely, we'll be talking more with John. We'll be at South by together in March. So I'm so curious what you've got cooking.
That's going to be another great milestone. And, who knows, might convince you to join me, and we'll do something jointly and throw the cameras on that.
I love it. Well, thank you so much.
All right. Well, I appreciate it. And I wish you all the best in the run-up. Hope you had a good Thanksgiving.
Thank you for spending some time with us today. We're just getting started and would love your support. Subscribe to Creativity Squared on your preferred podcast platform and leave a review. It really helps. And I'd love to hear your feedback. What topics are you thinking about and want to dive into more? I invite you to visit creativitysquared.com to let me know. And while you're there, be sure to sign up for our free weekly newsletter so you can easily stay on top of all the latest news at the intersection of AI and creativity. Because it's so important to support artists, 10% of all revenue Creativity Squared generates will go to ArtsWave, a nationally recognized nonprofit that supports over 100 arts organizations. Become a premium newsletter subscriber or leave a tip on the website to support this project and ArtsWave. And premium newsletter subscribers will receive NFTs of episode cover art and more extras to say thank you for helping bring my dream to life. And a big, big thank you to everyone who's offered their time, energy, and encouragement and support so far. I really appreciate it from the bottom of my heart. This show is produced and made possible by the team at Play Audio Agency. Until next week, keep creating.